Okay, today we are going to continue looking at Chapter 1 in your government book. It's Section 2. If you'll go into Google Classroom, and you can pause the video if you need to, you can find the notes for Chapter 1, Section 2 there, and you will just copy what's in red onto your notes, and you'll submit that for a grade because it's an easy grade. So we're going to look at forms of government today. And the first question on your notes is, what are the classic forms of government? You'll notice in your notes there are three listed: monarchy, dictatorship, and democracy. Well, we're going to look at each of those, but we're going to kind of break it down into even smaller sections so that you can kind of get an idea, because there is more than one type of monarchy, more than one type of dictatorship, etc. So we're going to look at the various ones, and just feel free to pause the video anytime you need to catch up or whatever you need to do. Number one, a monarchy. A monarchy is a government ruled by a king or queen, and the power is inherited. There are some examples of monarchies that we can think of. I think immediately of the United Kingdom or England. You know, they have the Queen, Elizabeth II. Spain has a monarchy. Holland has a monarchy. Saudi Arabia has a monarchy. There are several countries in the world that still have a monarchy where they have a king or a queen, and in some places they may go by a different name. For instance, in Brunei, it's the Sultan. But that's another word for king. That's an Arab word. But power is inherited. In other words, it is sent down through the oldest child or the oldest son, depending on the particular country it is. In England, you have Queen Elizabeth II. Her oldest son, Charles, is going to be the next king, assuming he outlives her. And then when he dies, his oldest son, William, will be the king. And then his oldest son, George, is going to be the next one in line. So it goes on down that way. There are a couple of types of different types of monarchy. You have an absolute monarchy, which is a king or a monarch that has total power. A good example of that would be the Kingdom of Jordan, which is over by Israel in the Middle East, the Kingdom of Brunei, which is kind of in Southeast Asia. Those are countries where they have a king that exercises total power, and whatever they say goes the way, or whatever they want to do, they do, and there's no one that can say anything about it. That's just the way it is. Most governments used to be that way, but in the last couple of 250 years or so, things have changed. Now, where you have a monarchy, most monarchies in today's time are what you call a constitutional monarchy, where the king or queen has limited power. An example would be the United Kingdom. The Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, she has power, but her power is limited. Parliament, or their lawmaking body, makes the rules, and she has to sign off on them. That's just the way it is. And she has some measure of authority, but not much. The same in Spain. Spain has a king, King Felipe, and he is very limited in his own power. If Parliament there passes a law, he's required by law to sign it, or if he doesn't, he has to abdicate his throne. So, I mean, they have limited in those countries the power of the king, and that is a constitutional monarchy where they have still have a king or queen, but that king or queen's power is limited in some way or another. Okay, we're going to move on now and talk about a dictatorship. A dictatorship is when you have a one person, or a small group that has all authority. In other words, they run the country, and you have either one person or one group that has all authority. A good example of that would be North Korea, where you have the Kim Jong-un is the leader of the country, and he has all the authority. He does what he wants to. Nobody can say anything or do anything opposite of him. He makes the rules, and he does whatever. That's just the way it is. In Iran would be another one. They have a small group there. We have what they're called the Ayatollahs, which are religious leaders that run the country. Now, technically in Iran, they have a president and a parliament and all that, but the Ayatollahs have ultimate authority over the elected offices, and so that would be a dictatorship. Okay, under dictatorship, you have regimes that are called totalitarian. Notice how the word total is part of this word, totalitarian. This means that the government not only controls the government, you not only have one person or one group of people that controls the entire government, but they control every aspect of your life. North Korea would be a perfect example. In North Korea, you don't watch anything they don't want you to watch. You don't read anything they don't want you to read. You don't say anything they don't want you to say. They control every aspect of your life. Some dictatorships are not totalitarian. You may have a person or a group of people that run the country, but you still have a measure of freedom outside what the government says. But a totalitarian, they control every aspect of your life. Cuba would be another one, although it's probably not as totalitarian as North Korea would be. Another one would be an oligarchy, where you have a small group of powerful people that control the government. So in an oligarchy, that's like the country of Iran that I was talking about earlier, where you have this group of religious leaders called the Ayatollahs who run the country. That would be an oligarchy. Even in a place like Russia, for instance, where they supposedly have democracy, you really have a group of powerful people that run that country pretty much however they want to. So you could say they're kind of an oligarchy. Not officially, but in reality, they would be. You have also what's called a theocracy. Let's go back to letter B, for instance, for just a moment. Oligarchy. A good example in history would be Sparta. You remember the ancient Greeks? They had the city-state of Sparta. They were an oligarchy. Now we talk about a theocracy. A theocracy, that word theo is the Greek word for God, and this is the Greek root for government. So in a theocracy, you have religious leaders that control the government. Iran would be a good example of that, where the religious government is there. An example in history would be ancient Israel before they had kings, when they just were run by judges. That was a theocracy. Okay, so those are different types of dictatorships. Now we're going to look at democracy. The word democracy literally means rule by the people. Okay, self-rule would be another way you could say that. And there are different kinds of democracy. There is a direct democracy where citizens vote on every issue and majority rules no matter what. An example of that would be ancient Athens, once again another Greek city-state, where the citizens of the city, and most people that lived in Athens at the time were not citizens, but the citizens of the city met regularly and they voted on every issue. They might have had some leaders, but those leaders couldn't do anything without the people voting, without the citizens voting. And that's what a pure democracy is, or a direct democracy. Pure democracy is another term for it. We really don't have that in America. Now, if you were to go to New England, in some of the small towns and villages of New England, they have a direct democracy. They don't necessarily elect a mayor and a city council like we do in Texas, but the town would get together and have a town meeting once a year or however often they need to, and they vote on every issue. And so that does exist on a small scale. When our founding fathers were looking at our country, they believed that direct democracy would not be possible with the size of our country. And it was tiny back then compared to what it is now. Can you imagine trying to vote on every issue, every citizen trying to vote on every issue? We can't even really get people to turn out to vote for elections once every 2 or 4 years, hardly. So direct democracy would be a big challenge. Plus, there are lots of other issues that we don't really have time to talk about today. But direct democracy is not something we have. I want you to notice majority rule. In a direct democracy, the majority rules no matter what. And so the majority, in other words, 50% of the vote plus one person controls what the other 49% does and can do whatever they want to them. An old example of democracy or direct democracy would be 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for dinner. Yes, it's pure democracy and majority is going to rule, but that does not mean that the person who loses their vote is going to be in a good shape. Okay, so that's a good example of direct democracy. It sounds good, but it doesn't really work out very well, especially on a large scale. Republic, also known as a representative democracy, is where people elect their representatives. For example, the United States. You'll notice in a republic like ours, we don't just have majority rule, but we also protect the rights of the minority. In other words, the majority of people in America can't vote to enslave the minority of people in America. The majority of people in America can't vote to tax only those who lost the vote. You just can't do that. There are protections in place for those who do not win the election. And that's why our government works the way it does, and we'll get much more into that as the semester progresses. But we live in a republic or a representative democracy. I want you to know that our founding fathers did not call our country a democracy. In fact, they hated that term. They believed that a democracy, a true democracy, led to what was called the tyranny of the majority. Tyranny is when the government runs all over the people. And so they felt like if you had a true democracy, the majority of the people would run all over everybody else. And they are correct on that. That's why we don't have that. We have a republic, or sometimes in modern times called a representative democracy, but the founders would never have called it that. So we elect our representatives. We have a deliberative system for things to get done, and it is protects the rights of those who don't win the election. Okay, so now we want to look at number 2 on your notes. How is national power organized differently in unitary, federal, and confederal system? These are terms you need to make sure you're familiar with. In a unitary system, sovereignty or authority, if something is sovereign, it has authority, sovereignty or ultimate authority rests in a single national government. Lower governments derive all their power from the national government. A good example would be the United Kingdom or Japan or France. In fact, most republics or representative democracies in the countries have a unitary system where you have a very powerful central government. And you may have state and local governments, or what we would think of as state and local governments, but those lower level governments only have power that the national level government gives them, okay? And so the national government has all power. United Kingdom, you have the parliament, but and then they have local cities and things in the United Kingdom, and those cities have governments, but those governments can only operate as the national government tells them to do so. Japan, France are the same way, okay? So unitary, it's concentrated in one government. Notice the unitary, that's one government with all the power, and any smaller governments derive their power from that main government. We have a federal system, which is what ours is, and when our country was founded and we set up a federal system, ours was a very unique system, and not many countries do it to this day. There are some who've emulated it, but not many. In a federal system, you have sovereignty divided between a national government and smaller regional governments. Example would be the United States. So we have our national government, which has certain rights and powers under the Constitution. But we also have our state and local governments, which also have certain powers under the Constitution. So our state and local governments have their areas of authority. Our national government has its area of authority. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't, but they don't derive their power. It's basically government with a central government and regional governments that all have their own power, their own sovereignty, and can do their own things. For instance, in the United States, our national government is the only one that can regulate trade between our country and other countries. States can't do that. They don't have that power. But on the state level, states are the only ones that can regulate education. Okay? And so the national government has no authority over that. And we'll talk more about that in the future, but that's what we have. And then the last system, which is one that is very rare and does not really work as well, is a confederal system. It's what the Confederacy was, and it's what our country was before we had our Constitution. Remember, our first Constitution as this country was the Articles of Confederation. In a confederal system, power rests in the regional governments. In other words, the state governments are strong, and they'll delegate certain powers to the national government, but those powers are very weak, and they can only do so much. There aren't too many examples in the modern world. The United Arab Emirates and the European Union are two of those type of confederal systems. In history, our country was at the beginning, but it didn't work, so that's why we got rid of the Articles of Confederation and had the Constitution. And during the Civil War, the South was a confederacy or a confederal system, and one of the reasons for the loss of the war in the South was because the Confederacy did not give the national government enough power to really execute the war. That's a whole nother class. We'll talk about that some other time. But those are the types of ways that power is organized differently in different systems. Make sure you're familiar with those. And number 3, in what ways do presidential and parliamentary systems differ? In a presidential system, you have a president who is elected by the people for a limited time. The president has its own office, has its own branch of government. It shares power with the legislative branch, and in our country, it shares power also with the judicial branch. And the legislative branch is completely separate from the presidential branch. Let me say that again. The presidential branch is completely separate from the legislative branch. The United States is a good example of that. We elect our president, and we also elect our senators and our representatives, but they don't elect each other, okay? And so they each have their own powers and their own authority, and they share power together. Most representative democracies or republics have what's called a parliamentary system, which is where you have executive and legislative branches combined. So what they'll do, and this is a good example, England or the United Kingdom is a good example. People elect their members of parliament, which is like their Congress, and then members of parliament, whoever wins the majority in parliament, will elect their leader to be the prime minister. So really, the prime minister of Great Britain is a member of parliament who has been elected by parliament to serve as the executive branch. So in a parliamentary system, your legislative or lawmaking branch and your executive, which is the law enforcing branch, are all combined into one. And the prime minister is chosen from that legislative branch called the parliament. Okay, United Kingdom would be something like that. Most countries that are representative democracies have this system. All right, and we're going to stop there. Please let me know if you have any questions. Make sure you do any work that is in the Google Classroom for you to do. Hope you have a good day.